Iran is a threshold state, and President Trump is running the world because he's the president of the United States, and his idea now is to solve this problem diplomatically. He keeps telling and reiterating the policy is to bring Iran to the table and make this nuclear program going back by diplomatic means. I want to start with you, Dan, and asking, regardless our opinions about it, from an expert analysis, either an agreement that both Ali Khamenei and Trump can agree on, whether the maximum concessions the Iranians can make meets the minimum requirements by the U.S. administration.
Thanks, Moav, and it's good to be back at INSS. It's like coming home. Let me just make a couple observations before I really hit the question that you're asking. First, Iran, I think it's important to emphasize, while also on the cusp of being able to be a breakout nuclear state, is also at its weakest point at any time in recent years, maybe even in recent decades. And that's the result of an incredible series of events, largely taken actions by the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence services against Hamas, against Hezbollah, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Assad regime, successfully defending against Iranian attacks in April and October, and of course successfully striking in Iran in April and especially in October. All of that, by the way, done in very close coordination with the United States, with CENTCOM, between CENTCOM and the IDF. None of those achievements are things that only one of us achieved alone. Those were combined Israeli-U.S. achievements that have put Iran on the back foot. And so there's an opportunity with Iran seeing its proxy network and its own air defenses and its own ballistic missile production capability really damaged, to continue to keep the pressure on and keep them on the back foot. That's even separate, but runs alongside the nuclear diplomacy.
Even though up until now, just to interrupt you, external pressure on Iran hasn't made the leadership in Iran to say, okay, we give up the nuclear program. On the opposite, it pushed them to the corner where say we must have a nuclear program in order to defend ourselves from being toppled by the West.
So with all those other assets hurt, they may in fact be motivated to move faster, which makes the diplomacy and the military option, which we'll get to second, even more urgent. So President Trump, as you said, has announced his preference for a deal, that he wants to negotiate a deal. He really only emphasizes the nuclear issue in that deal. He's not, in his description of it, talking about a comprehensive agreement that addresses Iran's regional activities. We should talk about that. He, of course, announced in his first few days in office a return of maximum pressure, an executive order that reimposes a whole series of sanctions. But I think we should be honest that it takes time for those sanctions to have an effect. Iran already is in very severe economic distress, but for those sanctions to have an effect and for the United States government to be staffed in order to actually enforce those sanctions against China or to prevent Chinese purchases of Iranian oil and other sanctions evasions, takes time. It's not something that's going to happen between February and April. It will take much of this year to get that architecture to really be effective. And of course, there's a looming issue, which is the threat of snapback sanctions that the United States, no longer a member of the JCPOA, cannot execute. Only our E3 partners, the UK, we'll get to it, France and Germany have the capability to initiate that snapback, and that has to be done by late summer, early fall. So we have about a 6-month window to try to use the pressures of that, the pressures of the economic sanctions, and the possibility of diplomacy to see if there's an opening. So let me just say to your question on diplomacy. I think the president is going to offer direct negotiations with the Iranians, and I'm not sure if that will even get off the ground, but he prefers to do that bilaterally. Of course, it should be coordinated as much as possible with European partners. I want to just put in parentheses that the utter shift of the U.S. position on Ukraine, which we saw in this kind of shocking vote at the UN General Assembly yesterday, endorsing the Russian position and not criticizing Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, has put a lot of tension into the U.S.-European relationship, and I don't know exactly how that could spill over to coordination on Iran. The agreement that Trump should seek, and I think he would try to seek, would require absolute clarity on full dismantlement of Iran's advanced enrichment capability, the export of its highly enriched uranium stockpile, full verification and absolute adherence to IAEA protocols to ensure that it doesn't, in undeclared sites or in, obviously, its declared nuclear sites, cheat. That is the kind of agreement, only kind of agreement, that could provide actual credible assurance that Iran is not going to, in a period of time, go back to producing. One thing that should be different from the JCPOA is it should not have sunsets. These restrictions should be made permanent. Now, to your question, is that an agreement that the Iranian leadership, that the Supreme Leader can agree to? I think it's very unlikely. The Iranians are very adept at stretching out these negotiations, at trying to divide between the U.S. and other partners in the negotiations. Of course, there's this new U.S.-Russian coordination on Ukraine. Again, something quite different and shocking, but that may create openings for Iran to exploit. We haven't seen any sign yet that President Trump is using his shift on Ukraine in Russia's favor to get Russia to be more cooperative in putting pressure on Iran. Maybe he will, but we haven't seen that yet. But I think, to your question, if in that period of time we're talking about the next 6 to 9 months, is there an agreement that would meet all of those requirements that the Iranian leadership will agree to in that period of time? I think it's very unlikely, which means that the military option has to very much be on the table, and we'll get to it in the next round.
We'll get to it. Thank you, Dan. Just a second, Sima. I want to go over to Simon first. Usually, it's working. It is. Usually, we look at the Iranian issue as a two-players game, the U.S. and Iran, and maybe Trump wanted to be a bilateral game. And I want to ask you about the role of the E3, of the three European superpowers, Germany, France, and the UK, and the incentive and the benefits that the negotiations can have using your power.
Thank you. Well, I think it is clear, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that the E3, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have an absolutely central role in the resolution of this problem. And it's worth saying at the outset, rather as Dan did, that we very clearly recognize the very serious state of the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, a couple of important facts are worth just registering, and I know to this audience, it's very unlikely that anyone will need persuading, but they are producing 60% high-enriched uranium at a higher rate than ever before. The IAEA estimates that every month they are producing one significant quantity of high-enriched uranium. That's enough to make, in principle, a nuclear weapon with further enrichment. There is no possible civilian justification for this. It's more than any other state without nuclear weapons has done. And it's, of course, in total breach of the JCPOA. So I set that out because I want to make clear that when we in Europe argue for a negotiated approach, that's not because we are in some way naive or weak or soft about the problem, the threat that Iran presents, quite the contrary. But we do see an important opportunity. Dan has set out the important strategic shift, and we see that the Iranians do want to negotiate. Now, the E3 negotiators have been in touch, have had several rounds of conversations with their Iranian counterparts in the last few months. We see strong signs that they want to keep talking. Now, yes, of course, we're not naive. We know that they will seek to drag that out. We have told them very clearly that there is a deadline for doing a deal, and that deadline is the middle of the year. It's end of June.
Middle of the year?
Middle of the year.
I thought you would say October, which is the deadline for the snapback.
October is the point at which the snapback mechanism expires. If you wish to use the snapback mechanism, you have to start the process well before October, and so we would need to start the process in the middle of the summer. So that
let me make it harder for you.
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, Mr. Zimt just before us was on stage, and I'm sure he will tell us that the Iranians have learned how to deal with a sanctions policy. That is, they can maintain economic reality within a very hard sanctions reality. So the sanctions haven't made them to capitulate. One. Second, the principal arguments by the Israeli government led by Netanyahu is that the JCPOA that you have supported was problematic because when it comes to the sunset, when it expires, it gives Iranians almost a carte blanche to do whatever it wants, and then the JCPOA enabling a nuclear Iran. And if he wants now to go to some kind of the same provisions of the last agreement, the JCPOA, you're not solving the problem.
Okay, well, let me start with the last point first. So we are completely clear that we are not looking for JCPOA reinvigorated or reimagined or reinvented. We are not looking for a new version of the JCPOA. We're looking for a totally different sort of deal, a deal which gives a complete guarantee that Iran is not going to develop a nuclear weapon.
So you think the JCPOA was a mistake?
No, I don't. It was the right deal for the time. But the situation has now changed. When the situation changes, you change your approach. We're in a different world now, and we need a deal that gives us a long-term confidence that Iran will not become a nuclear power. And the role that the E3 play, our ability uniquely to trigger the snapback mechanism, makes the European role extremely important. And yes, Iran will try to draw it out, but we are alert to that possibility. It's worth also mentioning the really important role we play at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, which is very important for establishing independently and unequivocally what the facts are of the Iranian nuclear program, and it is an important venue for holding Iran to account. Now, the UK in particular, working with our German and French colleagues, have been a leading player in getting in pushing Iran to account. We have remained robust and strong on this even when others have not. So that mechanism remains extremely important, and we intend to continue to use it.
Thank you, Ambassador Walters. Sima Shine, there is a growing sentiment following October 7th and following the success of Israel as Dan just laid out in the pressure on Iran. Following that, there is a growing sense and vocal arguments within the Israeli leadership saying that this is a timing for a military attack by Israel on the Iranian nuclear sites, on the Iranian nuclear programs. This is the right time to do it. And I want to ask you, why not? Why not to use this exceptional timing and a very friendly, or I would say, kind of an American president that supports the current government in Israel and go for a military option to deal with the Iranian nuclear program?
So let me start by saying, first of all, something that relates to both Dan and Walters about where does it stand with the agreement? Because before, if there is an agreement, if there is a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue between the US and Iran, or between the US and the Europeans and Iran, Israel will not strike. So let me say a word about an agreement. The question whether an agreement is possible and what is it from the Israeli point of view. So first of all, I agree with Dan. I think the minimum and the maximum of both sides does not reach each other, and there is a huge, unfortunately, a huge gap that will be difficult. I don't want to say that it will not be.
A gap between the Americans and the Iranians.
Of course.
Not to mention the Israelis and the Americans.
And now I'll say a word about the Israelis. Israel will be in a very... Remember what his way of behavior when the JCPOA was on the way, even before it was signed or agreed. He went to the Congress to try and persuade the Americans not to go for the JCPOA. And then, the minute it was agreed by the sides, he came out opposing it. So what will happen now if there is an agreement between Trump and the Iranians? Is Netanyahu able to go against Trump?
No.
I think you answered it better.
No, but
than
Dan
me.
is suggesting that
So-
the agreement will be closer to the agreement Netanyahu
No.
wants
So
rather than
first of- so-
the JCPOA.
First, he will not. Second, he will make that Trump will go for 000. That's the Israeli position. Iran shouldn't have a nuclear program, which I completely agree, of course. But the question, of course, is if it is a real option. I don't think it is, to make it clear. But I do think that Israel will be in a very difficult to go against any agreement, and my fear is, my concern is that Trump will go for an agreement in order, for the sake of an agreement, because he came and he said, I want an agreement, that's the best way for you. And the possibility of the Iranians, they are saying, every second Iranian is saying, we are willing to go for negotiations, we want an agreement, and we are able to, we will give the commitment not to go for a nuclear device. And that's what Trump was saying. He doesn't want Iran to be nuclear. And they say, we will give it. So I'm concerned that that will be enough for the Americans, and this is something that will not be acceptable even for me. Now to your question about the military strike, I would like, there is a poll that the INSS has just conducted on this issue, and I will be happy if it could be on the screen. What does the Israeli think about a military strike? Well, if it's not on the screen, it is. Okay, great. So the first question was whether Israel should attack the nuclear sites. In any case, also without the cooperation with the U.S. And as you can see, 33% of the Jews in Israel thought it should. No, just a minute. Let me see if I'm correct. No.
33%.
Jews
Yeah.
and nine in the Arab community, and the common decade is 28, which is very, very low. Now the second question was whether Israel should attack the nuclear sites with the cooperation of the U.S. And here you see a huge support. 53% of the Jews in Israel, and only 23 of the Arabs, and the compound is 47. 50% of the Israelis support an attack. And the last one, whether Israel should prevent itself from any attack, there was a very, very low support for that in the society. So what comes out from this poll that was conducted a week ago is that the Israeli society thinks, probably after years of being preached for that Israel should attack the nuclear sites in order to prevent a nuclear capability in Iran. Now the question, of course, will be whether Israel can do it on its own. I'm not relating to that. I don't know, I'm many years out. But I can say one thing. The worst possibility for Israel will be to go for an attack that will not destroy the program and will enable Iran to go and to rush, not to just go, to rush for a nuclear device. So Israel, if Israel decides to do it without the US, it should be completely, should be sure, more than 100% that it can ruin the program in a way that it will take years to rebuild it. Now, of
Without
course,
going into confidential details, is it likely to happen? Is it reasonable to think that it's real? That Israel can dismantle the whole program by its own?
I think one, the US can do it, no question.
No, us.
Let me start by going from. Second, I think Israel and the US can do it very well. And third, I think Israel can do a huge harm to the project. I don't know if it is able. I don't know if Israel is able completely destroy the project. And therefore, I think at the end of the day, cooperation between Israel and the Trump administration would be very important. I think it might happen if, first of all, if Iran makes a mistake. For instance, when snapback, if the UK goes for snapback, the Iranians are saying they will leave the NPT. If they leave the NPT, this is a huge problem, and it might be a reason for an attack.
Ambassador Shapiro, I wanted to turn to you. Trump wants a diplomatic solution, and you have to carry a big stick when you're going to negotiation. And the question is, what does Trump carries? I mean, is it a credible military threat? Is it only maximum pressure economically and politically? And some, not surprisingly contradictory announcement. He doesn't want any new wars. He came to finish wars, not to start new ones. On the other hand, he every now and then promised that the gates of hell will be open on different parts of the Middle East. So, what do you make of the threat that the Trump administration is posing on Iran if Iran is not going to come to terms with what the U.S. wants in an agreement?
So in addition to the leverage of the snapback possibility, in addition to the maximum pressure sanctions, there's no question that a credible military threat is essential to any chance, whatever the chance is, and I think it's low, but whatever the chance of a successful diplomatic approach and an agreement being reached, that's only going to be true if the Iranians perceive that there is a credible military threat. So there are a lot of things that go into making sure that threat is credible, including the intent ultimately to use it. One is the broader posture the United States has in the Middle East. If, for example, President Trump listens to the voices in his administration who says, we don't really need to have our troops in Syria, we don't really need to have our troops in Iraq, even though that's not about the nuclear program, but it is about, it's about counter ISIS, but it's also about being able to compete with Iran for influence in those arenas. The Iranians will not take very seriously the threat of a military strike, because it will be following the path that he says, I want less involvement, I want fewer wars. So remaining firmly present in the region is part of that. Obviously, coordination very closely with Israel is part of it, because there are different range of options. There are U.S. capabilities that Israel does not have that would do greater damage to this program. Israel, no question, can do significant damage to the program. If it does, it's going to need U.S. assistance, just as it had significant U.S. assistance and coordination in the strikes it took in October that took out the Iranian air defenses and the Iranian ballistic missile production capabilities. That's a coordinated effort, but together we can do more. There are some who suggest that the United States might make available to Israel certain capabilities that Israel does not have, that the U.S. has. That is not realistic on the timeline we're talking about. The amount of time,
even not under Trump?
It would not. My experience at the Department of Defense tells me that it would not be realistic in the timeline we're talking about, 6, 8, 9 months, to get Israelis the access and the training and the preparation abilities they've never used before to be able to execute something as persistent and important as this. Not that Israel isn't capable of it, but there isn't time to do those preparations. There are other things we can do together. There's some joint exercises we might resume if Israel's operational tempo is lower because Hezbollah and Hamas those wars are not as active. Maybe there's room for some joint exercise that can signal to the Iranians. There are other things we have to prepare for. We, the United States, we have bases throughout the Gulf that would be within range of Iranian short-range ballistic missiles as retaliation for any strike. And so we would need to begin to do the force protection and the reassurance to our Gulf partners that we would help protect them and also have access to use their airspace and use those bases to help us with that attack. The Iranians would see going on. We would have to do it to protect ourselves. We would also be able to signal to the Iranians that we're serious about potentially using that military option by doing those steps. So all of those are steps that can be taken in the next 4, 5, 6 months while there's an attempt to negotiate, while the threat of snapback holds on, while the maximum pressure sanctions start to have their effect. Ultimately, though, the moment of truth decision could come as early as this fall if Iran withdraws from the NPT if Iran is right up against breakout, if the sanctions and the other tools have not brought them to actually essentially agree to all the conditions I laid out earlier, that moment of truth will come. And then it's a conversation between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Who does it? Do we do it together, or do we do it in some coordinated fashion?
One sentence, Rag, to remind all of us, when Trump was talking about Iran in the press conference with Netanyahu, he said, I called them to come to the table for an agreement, and if no, Israel will attack them. He didn't say the US will attack them.
Yeah. So maybe the worst thing that can happen, Trump will give a green light to Netanyahu and say, okay, go ahead. You have my
he has
green
to
light.
decide.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Dan, to conclude, so you say that you don't see the Iranian and the US administration agree on the same provisions of an agreement. The gap is too wide. And then you said, we're saying that sanctions haven't been effective up until now to make Iranian capitulate. So practically say it will come within this year, 2025, to a point that Trump and Netanyahu will have to decide how they're going to perform a military attack, but it's going to happen. Because other than that, Iran is not going to be back down within the nuclear program. I mean, there is no other conclusion from what you're saying.
I think it's very likely they will be faced with that decision later this year. The fact that they can make clear through preparations that they're prepared to use it is an additional leverage that may help make it unnecessary by a more successful approach through negotiations. But a credible military threat is only credible if you're prepared to use it.
Let me make it harder for you, Mr. Shapiro. Trump is motivated by the economy situation in the United States, both in his mindset and of course, in terms of political internal interests. And if he decides to go to a war with Iran or to attack Iran, he might take into consideration that it's going to be a war, a regional war, where the Iranians will attack, oil facilities around the Middle East, U.S. American bases in Qatar and Bahrain and whatever. It's a full-scale war, which is dramatically going to affect oil prices around the world. Now, it's everything that Trump hates. Don't you think that in the moment of truth, Trump will say, let's go a little bit less with the agreement, just anything to avoid a full-scale war with Iran? Because, it's kind of against what he preaches throughout the past year.
Moav, I try never to read Donald Trump's mind. That's an occupational hazard I won't get into. But he will be faced with exactly that decision. And he has signaled in all the ways you've said his distaste for wars in the Middle East. He has members of his administration who are actively arguing that we have fewer interests in the Middle East. We should be focused exclusively on China. Frankly, if you really listen to what he is saying, he's saying he wants to negotiate with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping a 50% cut in defense spending by all three countries. Well, that's the end of American power projection in the Middle East and maybe anywhere outside of our own hemisphere. So if that is his vision of the U.S. role in the world, it's not very likely he would want to initiate what could turn into a significant conflict in the Middle East, not a one-night strike and then it's over.
You articulated the question, Mr. Shapiro.
I listened to him very carefully, but I don't try to read his mind.
Okay. Always a diplomat, huh? Ambassador Walters, I want to ask you, if it comes to October and the snapbacks are on and the Iranians are not willing to make these concessions required by the international community and they keep going with their nuclear program, would the UK support military options against Iran? First, support, and second, to join the efforts, the military efforts against Iran?
First of all, on sanctions and your skepticism about whether they'll work, I think bear in mind that the snapback sanctions are a very comprehensive set of sanctions, and that will have an impact. And it's very clear that the Iranians see that and they fear that. So that is a very powerful lever.
Even though, you know, in the JCPOA, in the years that led up to the JCPOA, we had China and Russia on board on sanctions. Now we do not.
There is an enforcement
So
challenge.
economically, it gives a lifeline, very important lifeline to the Iranian regime, even though we have sanctions.
Enforcement is a challenge, but all the same, sanctions of this breadth and depth would be very impactful. On the question of the UK's position, if it came to, if the United States or Israel chose to use military action, well, I mean, that's a very big decision that the UK would have to take. I'm not going to set British policy here on this stage. It'll be a decision for Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and his cabinet. And we're going to focus in the meantime on Plan A, which is to get a good deal, a deal that works through negotiations.
How you envision the deal? It has to address the nuclear program only, or much wider aspects of the Iranian military and I would say economically and the political spectrum?
Well, I mean, we're well aware of the multiple threats that Iran represents, not just nuclear, of course, but for Europeans, the Iranian support for Russia in Ukraine is a very serious grievance. Iran is responsible for the deaths of Ukrainians on the streets of Kiev and elsewhere. Iran is conducting terrorist operations and acts of subversion in Europe. It's not a secret, but it is not widely known that in the last 2 years there have been 20 attempts by the Iranian regime to kidnap or murder individuals in the UK, in Britain, which is an extraordinarily, we have prevented almost all of those. That's an extraordinarily aggressive posture by Iran. So we understand very well that Iran represents multiple threats, and we need to put an end to those threats. We need to be realistic about what we can cover in a deal, and a lot will rest on the negotiators' shoulders in the negotiating room. But we need to get to a position not only where we have dealt with the nuclear program, but where we have dealt with the other destabilizing and subversive behavior of the Iranian regime in this region and well beyond.
Thank you. Last question to you, Sima Shine. The situation is very complicated. The Iranians are within reach to be a nuclear power. The United States do not wish to go for a military attack as the first priority. In the diplomatic arena, we just discussed that. We don't know whether it's even realistic to think that there is an agreement in hand which will meet the requirement by Israel. If I were the Israeli Prime Minister will come to you and say, what is your best suggestion as what policy should we conduct now in order to make the Iranian nuclear threat as less imminent?
Very easy question, huh? Actually, I want to say, depending on everything that was said here, I think Israel cannot play alone on this scene. It's a very complicated issue. It's an issue that needs support, U.S. support, not only from the military point of view, which is of course very crucial, but also politically from the point of view of the international community, vis-a-vis the Europeans, vis-a-vis the Security Council. And the question is, of course, the day after an attack. Because Iran is not as they are saying. Everyone has to follow what they are saying and to understand that they are meaning what they say. They mean what they say, and they say we will attack back, and we will attack not just in one attack. We'll do it every week, every 2 weeks, every month, and that's not something that should be excluded from the scenario of an attack. So I do think that an attack must be an option, and a real option, not just to put it on the table, as everybody is saying, but a real option to be used. But before that, all other venues should be used, should be put on before the Iranians in a way, of course, with a demand not for a JCPOA 201, but for a much longer and much more profound agreement. The question you asked before also whether it should be only nuclear or also regional and other issues. I think we don't have time for a comprehensive agreement. Difficultly to say that we have time for a nuclear one, but not for all other issues. And I think first and foremost we should stop the program, and negotiations will stop the program and then start rolling it back, because Iran is just a political decision is needed in order for Iran to have they have enough material for around 10 devices if they decide politically to do it. So this is the situation we have never faced before.
Okay, 2025 is going to be crucial to the Iranian nuclear issue. From a journalistic point of view, it's good news, because next year when we're going to sit here, we will have the answers to these difficult questions. I want to thank you so much, Dan Shapiro, Sima Shine, Ambassador Walters. Thank you so much for listening.